Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Fox, and welcome to another session of Beyond the Noise. A goal for the Fox Alliance is to offer insight into big economic themes. Our topic for today is the debt dilemma. This will be a two-part series because there's just too much information to cover in one session. So today we'll be covering the problem, and next Tuesday we'll be covering the potential solutions. But today we'll be covering the history of America's debt, the difference between the debt and the deficit, what are the contributors to the debt, and the effects of rising debt on the country. Our panelists will be speaking for about 30 minutes, and we'll have time for questions after that. We'll need to not be able to take questions from the chat feature. So if you do have questions, if you could email me, bill@thefoxalliance.com, and we'll work on getting answers to those questions towards the end. Our presenters today will be Max Clark and Laura Cooper. Both are wealth advisors with the Fox Alliance. Our third presenter will be Josh Renfro. He is our managing partner. Max will be our first presenter. Max, please take it away.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. As we get started, I think it's important for us to consider what our founding fathers had to say about the economy and public debt and how that, could potentially impact the success of our country. So let's start out by taking a look at Thomas Jefferson. He actually had a lot to say about the economy and currency and public debt and everything connected with that. So here's what he said about public debt. He said, "I place economy among the first and most important virtues, and public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared. To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt." Well, unfortunately, I don't think our rulers have followed that advice. Because if we take a look here, this is a look at U.S. debt to GDP, looking back to basically right about the 1940s is when this starts. So what we're looking at here is a ratio between the U.S. debt as a whole in compared to the gross domestic product during any one year as a country. So if you look back to 1941 here over on the left-hand side, you can see that we are at 44.5% debt to GDP. That was just before we entered World War II, and you can see that debt skyrocketed in connection with World War II. We went up to almost 120% 5 years later, and that was really due to the fact that we were financing the war efforts, not only here at home, but also for the Allied forces. Coming out of World War II, we talked about this in our last presentation in connection with the currency in US dollar, but we entered a period of prosperity for the U.S., largely due to globalization and really the U.S.'s prominent role following World War II. So you can see that the debt to GDP ratio fell significantly. There were two reasons for this. One, we paid off some of the debt. But two, and more importantly, we experienced a huge increase in our gross domestic product over that time period, really between the late 40s and early 80s. And a lot of people will ask the question, why has it taken us so long to really experience the pain of overspending? Because we've been overspending for quite some time. And that's really the answer. The answer is that our gross domestic product, our prosperity as a country has been so significant that we really haven't experienced the pain associated with more significant debt as a country. Well, we're starting to feel it now. If you look over here to the early 2000s, you can see that we got up to right around 60% debt to GDP. And in 2008, 2009 is when we started to see things really pick up. And at the end of the the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, we had increased by about 20% up to 82. And that's when things really took off. You can see that in 2020, we had a huge increase here again, about 20% increase, and that was in connection with the pandemic and COVID. We hit kind of our peak in 2020 at 126%, And we're now at right around 120% US debt to GDP. Now, I think it's important for us to understand the difference between debt and deficit. Debt is really the total outstanding balance of all of our uh, obligations as a country. Deficit is the overspending that we have in any one year. So if you take a look here at this chart, this shows the US annual deficit from the early 80s until 2022. And you can see that in um, really from the 80s till the early 2000s, we were roughly running a deficit of $200 to $400 billion in any one year. And if you look here in 99, 2000, 2001, we actually experienced um, a miraculous event for the government, which was an actual surplus where we actually brought in more than we spent over those couple years. You guys probably remember that those were due to the efforts of Bill Clinton and those that were in Congress at the time. And that was a wonderful time and something that I'd love to get back to. However, since that time, it got worse. And if you see what occurred here from really 2002 onward, in connection with the great financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, we saw things fall substantially in terms of the deficit. We spent almost $1.5 trillion more in 2009 than we spent, or sorry, than we took in receipts. And then if you take a look at a little further in connection with COVID, our most significant deficit was almost $3.4 trillion, and that was in 2020. And it's come back, you can see, but we're still in 2022, roughly where we were at the peak of the great financial crisis back in 2009, running a deficit of about $1.5 trillion. So that's pretty significant. And as time goes on, the aggregate of all of those deficits over the years lead us to the significant public debt that we have right now as a country. So if you look back here, this is just a gross total public outstanding debt looking back to the mid 60s until now. And things were pretty low back in the mid 60s. And you can see that right around the turn of the century, we were at 5.6 trillion. And since that time, we have increased our debt by almost $30 trillion over the last really 23 years. So we've seen a significant increase there. And what I'd like to do is help us really put into perspective the enormity of that number. First, what I'd like to do is help us to really grasp that. Let's think about a million in terms of seconds. If you think about a million seconds, that was about 12 days ago, 11 and a half, 12 days ago. So that's a good amount of time. But if we then shift that over to a billion seconds, that's 32 years ago. That's a huge difference. And what about a trillion? A trillion is 32,000 years ago. A trillion seconds is 32,000 years ago. We're talking about an enormous number, and that's just 1 trillion. If we actually look at 33 trillion, which is what we have in debt, that's over a million years ago. We're talking about huge numbers here. I'd also like us to kind of visualize this a little bit more, and let's take a look at some of these images here. This shows us $1 million in $100 bills. Not a very large pile of money, honestly. But what about $1 billion? It increases pretty significantly. You can see that we got about 10 pallets plus a little bit of $100 bills. What about 1 trillion? This is a pretty significant difference here. On the right-hand side, you can see the White House in the background. There's a 747 airliner on a football field. We're looking at a lot of money. Here's another aerial view of it so we can kind of get a feel for how significant $1 trillion is. And what about $33 trillion in national debt that we have? Here's a look at the stacks of $100 bills that equate to our national debt. It's a little difficult to see, but you can see in the background there, kind of surrounded by those skyscrapers of $100 bills, is the Statue of Liberty, a crane in the front. I mean, we're talking about a lot of money. So where we're going to shift now is to take a look at some of the contributing factors to these, or to the debt that we're experiencing now. So I'll turn it over to Laura to take it from here.
Perfect. Thank you, Max. As Max mentioned, we've got a pretty significant mounting debt problem here in the United States. And this has been actually really exacerbated in the last 20 to 30 years. So I'm going to touch on some of the biggest ticket items that have really added to our current debt. So the first is our wars. And we're going to specifically look at the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. Now, as Max mentioned, the last time that debt to GDP was above 100% was after World War II. So it's no surprise, it's no secret that wars are extremely expensive. And for the war in Afghanistan, between 2001 and 2022, the United States spent about $2.3 trillion total in war efforts. Now, if we look at how that's broken down, the larger orange piece of the pie here, the majority of it, about $1.1 billion, is spent for the Defense Department overseas contingency operations. This is basically boots on the ground war efforts. That's the cost of it. Very small sliver, 60 billion spent in State Department, about 233 billion spent for veterans care, but almost half, over a quarter of the cost has been spent between increases to the base budget for war-related efforts and interest on the debt, $532 billion in interest on the debt alone. If we look at the war in Iraq, it's a very similar story. Between 2003 and 2023, we spent about $1.8 trillion. That does not include what is requested for this year, for 2024. And if you take into account the future costs between veteran medical care and disability costs, it's expected to be about 2.9 trillion by 2050. So we've spent between $5 and $6 trillion in the last 20 years on 2 wars. And as we see here, that number does not stop at the 5 to 6 trillions. Those veteran services will continue for the rest of those veterans' lives. You know, the cost of war does not end when the last troop comes home. This is something that we'll be experiencing for quite some time here in the United States. The second contributor are bailouts, and the most memorable is that of 2008. We spent about $500 billion in bailout funds in 2008. The majority of that was for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, about $311 billion to bail out those 2 federal housing programs. There's also about $90 billion for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, the Federal Housing Authority, Federal Reserve, FDIC, and the Small Business Lending Fund. So $500 billion in total. Now, for some of these programs, the government actually made money. Once all the loans were paid back, and with interest costs associated with that, some of these programs actually had a net positive. But when you look at the entirety of the bailout, it was definitely a net negative to the U.S. debt. So it added to the debt, even considering the fact that some of these programs did get paid back in full and then some. Which kind of leads to the third, and this is definitely one of the biggest ticket items, especially in the last 5 years, as Max mentioned. That's the COVID-19 pandemic. So far, we spent about $4.3 trillion in outlays, with an obligation of about $4.6 trillion. Now, as we are well aware, COVID-19 has not gone away. The cost for this pandemic is ongoing, something that we couldn't really account for, we couldn't plan for. Nobody really expected it to happen. And yet it has been one of the most financially devastating things that has happened to the United States in the last few decades. If we think about the timing of when this happened, you know, in 2020, we had a pretty large recession. GDP fell significantly. And when economic activity slows, one of the number one ways that the government makes their income, which is tax revenue, also decreases. If people aren't making more money, then they're not paying more in taxes. So we had a massive decrease in government income at the same time that we had a significant need for spending. So it exacerbated the debt problem, because we had to borrow more than we might have had we had a normal tax revenue year. The last thing I'll mention about the pandemic is the inflationary effects that the pandemic had. In the last few years, especially, we've talked a lot about inflation, and you know, inflation has come down in the last 12 months, but there have been significant inflationary effects that will last for the next decade or so. One of those is Social Security. As inflation goes up, the cost of living adjustment for Social Security also goes up. But what that means is that the cost of those entitlements go up as well. So the last thing that I'll look at here are those entitlement programs, Social Security and healthcare being the main two. For Social Security, there's two pieces to this. There's the retirement benefits side that most people are familiar with, and that's when you get a certain age, you can qualify to take your Social Security or survivor benefits. And then the smaller sliver is Social Security disability income. And in 2023 and 2024, we'll spend about $1.3 to $1.4 trillion in entitlements for Social Security. That's the estimated average. For 2028, that current number is expected to be about $1.8 trillion. So Social Security has been a topic of conversation for a really long time. It's no secret that the trust has come close to running out, if it's not already run out. And a big question is, how do we continue to fund these entitlement programs if the revenue to do so is less than what the entitlements are? When you combine that with the potential inflationary effects over the next decade and a half, it's going to be a really interesting solution, that if we can find a solution to fix it. But the current solution is to just borrow more to continue to pay off those obligations. And the last thing I'll mention here is the healthcare effect. So federal health subsidies, and the majority of that is Medicare. The second largest is Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program. Third largest are employer provided tax exclusions, and the smallest piece here, but definitely notable, is Obamacare. So by 2032, it's expected that requirement is about $3.3 trillion. So we have to pay about $3.3 trillion a year in paying for federal health subsidies. Right now, that number is about $2 trillion. But again, this is another piece that is affected by inflation. And as Joshua mentioned, it's a piece that is not expected to go down anytime soon. So with that, I will turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Laura. Appreciate that. As we move into this next section, I want to talk to you about some of the structural issues that contribute to the debt, because in understanding how we've gotten here, we don't need to simply understand the isolated incidents. One of the things that Laura is trying to talk through here is what are some of the largest contributors. We also need to understand what is structural about what we've done that has actually contributed to where we are today. So first, just understanding how the budget is constructed and what are the items that we have on here is really key. And so if you look here at this chart, what you'll notice is that Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and defense, plus interest on the debt, account for roughly 94% of all taxes that we collect. So let me repeat that. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, and interest on the national debt account for 94% of all the taxes we collect. So what does that mean? That means we only have 6% of our tax revenue left to literally pay for everything else. And obviously, we don't pay for everything else with that. We have a lot of other expenses. And so that's resulted in us having about a $1.4 billion deficit, money that gets added to the debt in 2023. And so that's huge. We literally have several areas here that really don't have a lot of wiggle room. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those aren't things we can change. Unless Congress comes together and decides to reform them, these expenses will always be. So when we talk about Congress cutting spending, unless people are actually willing to touch what are commonly called the sacred cows, defense, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, we really are only dealing with maybe 20 or 25% of the budget. At most, the overwhelming majority are things that we've already committed to. And this really reveals an important basic principle of economics. When we're thinking about first order effects, things that make material differences, we need to make sure that we don't make commitments to longer term programs where we don't understand how much our commitment can expand over time. When Social Security first started, the average life expectancy was 62 years old. The congressmen and women at the time who ultimately passed the Social Security Act would have never imagined having such a large portion of America use Social Security as a predominant source of income in retirement, nor would they have imagined it lasting for an average of 15 to 30 years. But that's what happens when you make an open-ended promise in a country where life expectancy has increased, and it has increased about 20 to 24 years over the last 70 years. And the challenge is there's probably a pretty good chance that life expectancy continues to increase, which only is going to put more weight on those systems. The other thing I'll note here is the amount of money that's going towards the interest. I'll have you note that 3 years ago, interest payments on the government debt was only about $230 to $240 billion. We've now seen that number climb to about $640 billion. And I've got some bad news. The story's not over there. Because a lot of people are like, oh, well, that's because interest rates have gone up. And the answer is yes, it's because interest rates have gone up, but there's still a large portion of the debt that is still locked in at a low 2% interest rate kind of number. We are going to see a lot of that debt roll over the next 7 to 10 years. And if interest rates remain high, let's put it this way, if we were to take all the debt we have today and to refinance it at a 4 to 4.5%, which is kind of a current going market rate right now for US government debt, we would be looking at total interest payments of somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.2 to $1.4 trillion. So unfortunately, the interest on the debt is likely to continue to balloon unless interest rates do meaningfully go down in the future, especially those years where we're going to get a lot of those government bonds maturing over time. So when we're thinking about structure, it's also important to think about specific individual pieces of structure that contribute to the problem. So one of those areas is this concept called use it or lose it budgeting. This is a federal system of budgeting that all departments use. And what it simply means is if you are given a budget of $1 billion as a department, you only get to have that budget of $1 billion the next year if you spend all of it. If you don't spend all of it, they cut your budget to what you actually spent. So what does that actually do? That promotes departments making sure that they always spend the full amount of their budgets. Once again, going back to first order effects, it's really important from an economic standpoint that you align the incentives with the desired outcome that you want. And the problem with use it or lose it budgeting is, what does it incentivize? It does not incentivize efficiency. It doesn't incentivize organizations to do more with less. It incentivizes organizations to make sure they always spend every single penny, because otherwise, even if they can be efficient one year, they will lose the ability to have that same money the next year, even if they need it. And so it's not a coincidence if we look at just one anecdote that really proves this. Spending in the last week of the year for government departments is on average 5 times more than other weeks in the year. The amount of money that gets spent on completely useless office supplies and other things like that are literally stuck in a warehouse and will never be used ever again is astronomical. And it all comes down to this concept of the use it or lose it budgeting method. So that's the first thing. The second thing is and I mentioned this earlier, we make these commitments to long, perpetual, lifelong expenses, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We as a people and as a government need to be thinking very, very carefully when we make lifelong commitments. The most recent notable one that we made was on the Obamacare side of things. That is yet another one of those commitments that we are making long-term commitments to, regardless of what the growth in that ultimately ends up being. And obviously, the classic example of where that's gone incredibly wrong has been Social Security. Once again, as I said earlier, people never expected Social Security to become what it is today. But that's the danger of making these open-ended promises, because they can become far more than you ever expect them to be. Another really good example of this would be healthcare. Healthcare today actually promotes rising costs. And once again, Medicare and Medicaid are two of the biggest expenses that the federal government is having to pay for. As Laura mentioned earlier, by 2028, we're expecting that number to be $3 trillion, 50% more than it is right now. That is going to be an astronomical cost that the government will continue to have to bear. And there are two major things that continue to push the cost of this up. The first of which is consumers are not given an incentive to care about cost. So think about it. If you have health insurance and you've already satisfied your deductible for the year, and you have a choice between going to a doctor who's going to charge $10,000 to the insurance company and another one that's going to charge $15,000 to the insurance company, is the cost going to make any difference in your decision? The answer probably, if you're answering honestly, is no. In most cases, probably what's going to make the biggest difference is who do you think will actually give you better medical care? That's the one factor you're going to think about. And because of that, we have people that make decisions exclusively based on quality without almost any consideration for cost, because we've created a system where we don't incentivize the customer or the consumer to actually care about those costs. And granted, I'll be the first person to admit there are obviously exceptions to this rule, but as a general rule, the American people are not given an incentive to care about the cost of medical care. The second example of construed incentives being in the wrong place is when it comes to a provision that was made under Obamacare. Under Obamacare, one of the rules that was made is that insurance companies cannot make a profit more than 20% of premiums. And at first glance, a person might be like, well, that's a great idea. Let's limit the profit of those insurance companies and make sure more money goes back to the actual healthcare recipient. That's a great idea, right? And on face value, I could understand that thought process. But think about it. What does that actually promote? What is the only way that an insurance company can actually increase their profits? If they're stuck at 20% of premiums, the only way it can grow is what? If healthcare premiums go up. We have literally, through that one law, created a perverse incentive where the only way an insurance company, there's only two ways that an insurance company can grow their profitability. They can actually have more clients, or they can see healthcare costs go up. That's it. Those are the two ways. And so once again, you need to make sure that you align the incentives with the desire that you have. And right now, health insurance carriers only have one major incentive, which is to see healthcare premiums go up. That's how they can increase their profitability. The last major area from a structural standpoint, once again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's a lot of areas where incentives don't happen to align with what we ultimately want, but these are four of bigger ones that we feel like have an outsized impact on the debt situation today. The fourth area is this idea of cost plus budgeting when it comes to the awarding of defense contracts. So let's just kind of walk through this. There is a competitive process, albeit it's with a small number of competitors in the defense industry whenever we're trying to supply anything from ammunition to tanks to missiles to planes. But the way that the Defense Department has set up their system is it's a cost plus system, which basically means you tell us what the cost to produce this is, and we're just going to give you an automatic 20% profit on top of that. Now, if you're wrong in terms of what the cost is, you have to eat it. You ultimately, actually, let me rephrase that. You don't have to eat it. The government still eats it, but it doesn't impact your profit. Your profit is still only going to be based off of what the original cost was. So there's some safeguards there, but think about it. Once again, what are we incentivizing? We're not incentivizing cost savings, because the defense contractor doesn't get to keep any of the profits that they could generate by being more efficient. And so the only way that that competition actually comes into play is if they feel like it's going to cost them in the initial bidding process. But as a result, we have seen the defense industry remain incredibly expensive, while a lot of areas have innovated a lot more than it. And this is one of our biggest line items on the budget. Defense is, I think, third or fourth in line in terms of being in size. And there's a lot of waste that ultimately happens here. So that'd be the fourth major area that we think has an outsized contribution to the situation that we're in right now. So let's talk briefly about three of the major effects of rising debt. The first of which is a greater percentage of government spending goes towards debt service. I've already talked about how even though $640 billion is a lot more than the $230 we were paying, 3 years ago, if things remain the same, that number will continue to grow. And it could grow to where it's half or even 60% of what the budget is today, which is a staggering idea. And when that happens, what does that do? That ultimately forces the government to have to make some very, very unpleasant decisions. One, do they raise taxes, or do they ultimately cut spending, or do they do a combination of both? And they will be forced to at some point. There is a limit And with the US, their limit is a lot higher than most, but there is a limit to what people are willing to lend without seeing interest rates go up dramatically. So eventually, at some point, that is a decision that they will have to make some hard decisions surrounding. The second thing is that debt, large scale government debt accumulation is usually highly deflationary for two reasons. One, because it takes money out of individuals' hands and out of businesses' hands, which are typically very productive when it comes to the use of that money, meaning the money in the hands of individuals and businesses typically result in the largest increases in GDP. Versus if you look at government use of that same money, the government is a far less efficient actor. So that's the first reason it's deflationary, because more and more money will have to be sucked out of the hand of productive members of society and put into the hands of less productive members of society, aka the government in this case. The second reason is because we are now forced to spend more and more money on the interest payment. Why is that significant? It's significant because what causes stable prices or even slight inflation is when you can have more and more money chasing the same amount of goods or fewer goods. Well, what happens when more and more of the money is getting sucked out of the room to pay interest and there's less and less money chasing after goods? It can actually tend to cause deflation, which actually leads to the third and final point, which is it also usually results in slower economic growth. Now, our country has partially seen declining economic growth because we've just gotten large. And as the economy gets larger and larger, the ability to grow at 5, 6, or 7% gets smaller because the size of what you've already created is so large. But don't be fooled. Part of the reason that we've also seen our growth continue to slow is that more and more money is having to go towards, one, the government, which is a less efficient actor, and two, because more and more money is having to go towards cost on the interest on the debt. And so that absolutely impacts and will continue to impact, probably much more severely in the future, economic growth, and will definitely put an additional weight on the economy's back. And so with that, we'll go ahead and open things up for questions. I will ask that as questions are asked, let's try to keep it to this portion of the presentation, which is dealing more with the problem and the structural nature of things. As Bill mentioned earlier, we will have another webinar next week to cover the solution or the potential solutions that could be out there. So let's limit the questions to the topics we discussed today.
All right, well, let's kick it off. So first question is, who actually owns the debt? Max, would you answer this one, please?
You bet it. It's a great question. I think something that we've heard a lot about, or at least a lot of concern about over the past several years. You hear a lot of people say, hey, we got to be really concerned because our enemy, China, owns most of our debt and we're going to be in big trouble because they can no longer, if they get upset with us, we're not going to be able to finance the things that we need to finance. The actual picture's very different. So if you look at the high-level holders of our public debt, almost a quarter, 22% of the outstanding debt is held by other government agencies. So think about things like Social Security or the military retirement system. They own a significant portion of the U.S. debt. The next quarter that would be that holds another quarter of our debt is the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve holds a big chunk of the outstanding public debt. As you know, over the past several years, probably the last decade or two, they've really become a lot more involved on the open market, doing open market operations where they're buying and selling U.S. debt. And their balance sheet has expanded significantly over the last several years. And I think right around the end of 22, beginning of 23, they had almost $6 trillion in outstanding debt. So they are by far the largest individual holder of our U.S. debt. Another quarter of the outstanding debt is held by foreign governments. About 22, 23% is held by foreign governments. The leading holders there are Japan, which is the biggest at 3.5% of our total outstanding debt, and China comes in second at less than 3%. So, when we hear all of this concern about China and these foreign governments being able to control us, the actual picture's much different than that. And then the final quarter is held by everyone else. So think of that as mutual funds and individual holders and banks and other things on that front. So truthfully, we have a very diversified portfolio, so to speak, of people who have lent us money as a country.
Thank you, Max. All right, our second question is, what about the unfunded liabilities of the US government? How much is that? Josh, would you answer that one?
Sure. So this is an area we didn't spend a lot of time in because, to be frank, one of the first challenges is determining exactly how large it is. Depending on what series of assumptions you have, you'll see estimates that range from our unfunded liabilities over the next 50 to 100 years is 80 trillion, and probably the higher end of the number that I've seen is in the 260 to 270 trillion dollars. It's obviously a huge problem. Once again, and a lot of it comes back, most of our unfunded liabilities come back to that first order effect that I mentioned earlier, which is making these commitments to these perpetual open-ended promises. Social Security, Medicare being the largest contributors to that. And so it's going to be a big issue. Now, the problem with all of these estimates is that it assumes right now that these systems don't get reformed at some point. We are not believers that that will be the case. The Social Security Trust Fund is expected to run out in the next 8 to 9 years. Probably will run out before then. The government's not great. They tend to be optimistic about the timeframes at which it'll last. So it'll probably be sooner than that. There is a very strong chance that at the time that the Social Security Fund runs out, because right now, roughly 75 to 80% of the Social Security payments and Medicare payments, or I guess Social Security payments rather, come from the payroll taxes that people pay on their paychecks. So at the point that the trust runs out, there's going to be a meaningful funding gap. My suspicion is that we will see Congress have to get their act together and finally reform the system. They'll probably tax some people some crazy amount of money. They'll probably cut some benefits / increase the age that people can apply for Social Security. There's a number of different things that they can do, and we'll talk more about that next time. And so while the unfunded liabilities number is, regardless of how you slice it, a huge number, I don't think it'll probably be quite as big as what most people project, because most people are projecting that nothing changes, which I think is an impossibility. But it still is a huge concern. And I think it's going to really, when we do see that debate happen and Congress is talking about reforming the system, I legitimately hope for people in my generation, I hope that there's a phasing out of some of those benefits, because we run into some substantial problems if we continue to have to make these promises to people for long periods of time. The system is not, it is called social for a reason. It's socialized. You have to have enough large earners that pay way more into the system than they'll ever get out. And you're going to have a large number of people that never pay anywhere close to what they get out of the system. So we really need to create a system that's much more sustainable over the long term. And that unfortunately is probably going to require some very difficult decisions. And I hope we have the fortitude to actually make some of them.
Thank you, Josh. Well, those are all the questions that we have for today. I want to thank our presenters, Josh, Laura, and Max. And this is an unusual one. We've got another meeting next Tuesday, as I mentioned before. So we all look forward to seeing you back next Tuesday to discuss solutions. Thank you, everyone.